Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much to the Canadian Human Rights Voice for inviting me to speak at this very, very important event. And I'm so honored to be a part of this really incredible, amazing set of speakers. Today my talk, as Todd said, is entitled Workplace Violence Through an Equity Lens. And much of what I'm going to discuss today comes from my doctoral research. Before I begin, it's very important to note that when I say or we use the word or term violence, I am including a variety of forms of violence that I see as interrelated with one another. And that includes physical, emotional, psychological, economic, political, and social harm and suffering. Recent media stories in North America have highlighted the continued prevalence of workplace violence, despite the introduction of related legislation. This suggests that not much has changed, in particular with regards to violence against women. Two very recent studies, timely and much needed studies, have been conducted within the Canadian context. The findings of these studies show that violence at work is a reality for Canadian workers, particularly for women. The Angus Reid Institute conducted a national survey of over 1,500 Canadian adults who are currently working or who have worked outside the home. The survey demonstrates that sexual harassment continues to be prevalent in contemporary workplaces, and that the vast majority of workers, 4 in 5, that's very, very high, never reported their experiences to their employers. While both women and men identified experiences of harassment, women are almost 4 times as likely as men to have been harassed. Domestic violence, or intimate partner violence, is a critical component of the discourse on workplace violence. Although research has demonstrated a relationship between work and family life, little attention has been given by organizations to domestic violence as a serious workplace issue. Domestic violence highlights the porous nature of the boundaries between the private and the public spheres, and the need for specific legislation and workplace practices to address this issue. Findings emerged in a recent key study conducted by the Center for Research and Education on Violence Against Women and Children at the Western University, in partnership with the Canadian Labour Congress. In this study, the first of its kind in Canada, shows a staggering size of this problem and the consequences for victims, co-workers, and organizations. Of the over 8,400 survey respondents, nationwide, 1/3, almost 34%, reported having experienced domestic violence. For more than half of these, the violence, for example, the harassing emails, calls and texts, stalking and physical violence, continued while they were at work or near the workplace. Elsewhere in the World Health Organization and the International Labour Office have studied and recognized the growing pandemic of violence in the workplace. An example of the studies includes a joint program on workplace violence in the health sector that was established in 2000. The program included country case studies in Brazil, Bulgaria, Lebanon, Portugal, South Africa, Thailand, and Australia. The studies found that these countries had prevalent rates of workplace violence ranging from 50% in Brazil to 76% in Bulgaria. The study report states that whenever violence is embedded in a society, it will be reflected in the workplace. Amongst the root causes of violence mentioned in these studies are, for example, the local social-economic realities, a society where violence is used as a way of controlling family, social, interpersonal, and institutional relations. Societies where forms of violence such as domestic violence and marital rape are not only illegal, but in fact acceptable if the perpetrator and victim are related. Another finding is the deeply ingrained stereotypes of behaviors based on roles of women and men in society. And finally, patriarchal beliefs of male domination and women's economic dependence on men. The latter two that I mentioned were linked to views of sexual harassment, specifically at work, as quote-unquote natural and within the normal order of things. What does it mean to view workplace violence through an equity lens? Before delving into this, let's spend a moment discussing the dominant view that still persists of workplace violence as an individualized phenomenon. And does anyone know what I mean by individualized? By individualized, I mean there's a concentration or focus on individual people, most specifically the perpetrator or victims, or a very specific act of violence. What does this individualized view do? Or doesn't do, we can ask, right? Or permit us to do. It has a narrow view of violence, normally related specifically or strictly to physical violence, where an emphasis, I was saying earlier, is on a single act or actors, normally the perpetrator and the victim, or that very restricted individual relationship. Forms of violence are viewed as distinct or unrelated to one another. Forms of harassment are not seen as violence, therefore less injurious and often unworthy of extensive prevention efforts. Psychological, economic, social aspects of abuse in this view are rendered invisible and unrelated to each other. The individualized view of workplace violence has a limited view of power. Most often it is limited to formal positions of victims and perpetrators within, for example, the hierarchical order within organizations. And that might be, for example, harassment of a worker by a manager, for example. The organization is viewed as separate from society in general. That is, it is separate from social dimensions such as gender, sexual identity, race, ethnicity, class, age, ability, and so on. The practices often remain on an individual, case-by-case, or incident-by-incident level. So the focus within these practices are very much on attitudinal and behavioral changes, which could, for example, be anger management skills of a perpetrator, right? The focus is on what is immediately measurable and quantifiable, and therefore very short-term in scope. All of the points I mentioned above impede us from understanding violence as an escalating process, and therefore from intervening early on in the process. Viewing workplace violence through an equity lens instead recognizes it as a social phenomenon rather than a strictly individualized one. In my doctoral research, I lay out what this entails and the outcomes. We don't have time to go through it today, obviously, but if you want some good bedtime reading, it should be, it will be available in the near future, hopefully online, so you can look it up. If you can't sleep one night, start from the first page. At the core of this framework, in which I'm going to discuss or focus on today, is the continuum of violence. Normally we think of the continuum of violence from something like harassment to physical violence, right? So kind of less physical to more physical violence. Now, and I propose something different in my doctoral research. And I'm going to just mention some points just to highlight the difference between this view and the individualized view of workplace violence. At the core of this framework, this continuum of violence, is an expanded, as I was mentioning earlier, conceptualization of violence that highlights the interrelated nature of forms of violence. It is not based on seriousness, so harassment is not less serious than physical violence, for example. So there's no kind of linear or hierarchical categorization of forms of violence. I'm not saying here that forms of violence don't have their unique characteristics. But what I am saying is that we need to see them as in relation to one another. Views of violence and its various forms as a process is very important in this view. This is the way I defined violence as a process. It is an act of violence. Sorry, an act of violence is a moment. Okay, that's the moment we kind of always focus on, right? Along a timeline in which all that has preceded it, surrounds it, and is part of it becomes crystallized and thereby visible. So when we concentrate on a physical act of violence, we do not see everything that happened before it, everything that happened during it, and everything that continues to happen afterward. So the process of violence does not end with an act of violence, as it continues to change those involved. Victim, perpetrator, witnesses, the community, the organization, and society. A processual view of violence is attentive to the conditions that produce it. So the focus is on how it has come to be. As the Canadian sociologist Dorothy E. Smith states, knowing how things are, quote unquote, put together is invaluable to those who struggle to bring about change. This view of the continuum of violence links the social and the individual, viewing them as products of each other. Therefore, at the center of the continuum of violence is an expanded definition or conceptualization of power. Power cannot be understood separately from social dimensions, as I was mentioning earlier, such as gender, class, race, and so on, within as well as outside of the workplace. This conceptualization of violence through an equity lens seeks to understand how social and structural systems of oppression and inequality interact with one another to create violence. Systems and institutions are seen as social processes and practices, rather than monolithic entities that cannot change. Therefore, it forces us to examine our workplace practices and processes, and how they may be sustaining inequitable social relations. And very common ones that we may not think of, right? Like hiring, promotion, compensation practices, for example. We need to challenge also what we often see, or statements that we often see in the literature and the popular media. And one good example that really gets to me is around bullying, right? So often I hear, well, women bully just as much as men do. So this to me represents a very narrow view of social dimensions of power, especially within empirical studies, right? So that is, the emphasis is really on demographics, right? Of men and women who bully. So that tells us very little about the process of bullying, which is a form of violence. The role of gender in that process, and it tells us very little of the social nature of this phenomenon. Viewing violence through an equity lens highlights the need for systemic change. Therefore, the emphasis is predominantly on prevention and long-term change, rather than solely on intervention later. Social and organizational change are central objectives of this approach. Viewing violence through an equity lens recognizes that violence in all its forms is experienced differently by socially and structurally located individuals. Evaluating a work environment from the perspective of workers most at risk benefits and safeguards all workers. In conclusion, to attempt to eradicate one form of violence requires efforts to eradicate all forms of violence. For this to occur, we begin by taking violence out of an exclusively individual realm. This requires an expanded and processual conceptualization of violence in which forms of violence are interrelated within a continuum. Workplace violence in all its forms must be recognized and dealt with also as an organizational issue, one that aims to question and change organizational practices and processes related to violence. And not only those practices specifically related to violence, but the organization in general. Workplace violence is also a societal issue. Hence, the organization cannot be viewed as separate from society, and more specifically, as removed from social dimensions of power. In particular, organizations need to view anti-violence practices as interrelated to those countering inequalities in the workplace. Research has clearly shown that not acting to prevent and address all forms of violence at work is not an option for organizations. Doing nothing condones and rewards violence, explicitly and implicitly. As recent media stories have shown, doing nothing exposes organizations and its workers to risks at multiple levels, including physically, psychologically, emotionally, socially, legally, economically, and competitively. It is important to recognize also that a single organization is not expected to carry out this phenomenal task. However, it does recognize its potential to be part of deep change. This has major, major implications for the role of government in assisting organizations. It is not a single person, group, or practice that creates change, but a coming together of a multiplicity of interrelated factors, agents, and practices.